Thanks for joining us today for the University of Minnesota Conservation Sciences Seminar Series. We're really excited to have Dr. Jacqueline Gill here speaking with us today. For anybody maybe new to the seminar series, so how we'll go about this is we'll leave about 45 minutes for Jacqueline, 50 minutes for her to give her talk, and then we'll reserve around 10 to 15 minutes at the end for some Q&A. So my name is Jack Raby. I'm a first-year master's student with Dave Meach studying predator-prey dynamics out in Yellowstone ecosystem, which you can see behind me. Before we get started, I wanted to let everyone know, if you have any questions, please feel free to put those in the chat, or feel free, don't be shy, unmute yourself at the end of the talk and ask questions that way. So it's my pleasure to introduce Dr. Jacqueline Gill. Dr. Gill is an associate professor of paleoecology and plant ecology at the University of Maine, with a joint appointment in the School of Biology and Ecology and the Climate Change Institute. Her lab explores how species and communities respond to climate change and extinction across space and time. She also co-hosts the podcast Warm Regards about life in a warming world. Jacqueline, take it away. The stage or screen is yours.
Thank you. Thank you so much for inviting me. I'm really excited to sort of join you virtually today. And I'm just going to go ahead and get started since I know we have limited time. So here we go. All right. So I'm going to talk today about some of the work that I've done as a paleoecologist, and this work is part of what's a growing field, a subfield of paleontology known as conservation paleobiology, which seeks to use these natural experiments that we have in past climate change and extinction and other processes like invasions that are relevant to our understanding of conservation and management today. So I'll kind of give you a little bit of an overview of some of the kinds of things that we're learning from the paleoecological record that are relevant to conservation, because we have these, like I said, natural experiments in climate change. And then I'll share a couple of examples of some of the recent projects in my own lab that, that speak to these questions more specifically. So a lot of this work is, even though we're focusing on the last mostly 2.5 million years or so in this talk, we're very much motivated by the concerns of a warming world in the present and the needs of the next decades and next century. And we know from climate models that the world is expected to warm between 2 and 4 degrees Celsius by 2100. And that can be a hard number to wrap your brain around. It seems like it's not a lot. So I actually find it really helpful to draw on one of my favorite webcomics, XKCD, and to think of it in terms of one ice age unit. So that's the difference. About 4 degrees Celsius is the difference between where we are now and then 20,000 years ago. Both in where you are in Minnesota and where I'm in Maine, we would have been under quite a bit of ice during the last glacial maximum. And if we move sort of one ice age unit into the future, that's roughly where we're expected to be by the end of the century. 2 ice age units into the future, we end up in a Cretaceous hothouse with 200 meters of sea level rise and no glaciers anywhere in the world. So we actually do have a pretty good bound, sort of bookends for the climatic possibilities of what 2 to 4 degrees Celsius actually means. And so I think that the last ice age is really a good model system for understanding how species and ecological communities and the processes of interest respond to these kinds of climate changes. So if we start 21,000 years ago, I've got a little cartoon animation here. One of the big differences was, we had this large ice sheet covering all of Canada, and most of, or a large portion of the available habitat in North America. And that's a tremendous amount of ecological and environmental change that species have had to cope with. And so we can use the fossil record that records their movements and their responses to those environmental changes to help us kind of constrain or inform our understanding of how species might do something similar in the future. And one thing I should note is that Often people think that just because something happened in the geologic past that it played out on geologic timescales, but many of the climatic changes that we've experienced during this process of deglaciation happened on the order of years to decades, certainly within the lifespan of many organisms. And the rate of climatic warming that we're expecting in the near future is on par with some of the rates of change that we have experienced as we came out of the last ice age. It's important to note that the starting point is different. Obviously, we're going from warm to warmer instead of cold to warm. But when we're thinking about things like rates of change, these are, I think, informative systems that we can draw on. And I would say, too, that we have this framework that we can draw on of move, adapt, or die. That's something that we often think about, or you often hear those terms when we talk about the options that species have in response to climate change. And the fossil record also gives us a fourth option that we don't talk about very much, and I'll kind of return to over and over in this talk, which is the idea of persistence. There is another option. Some things have wider environmental tolerances than we think that they might. And so this is a figure from Dawson et al. In 2011 that kind of looks at the paleo record as a model. And they look at, they have some representative examples of each of these kinds of responses or these modes from conifers and also ungulates. And so, we have examples of species that basically didn't shift their ranges or the kinds of habitats that they lived in very much. They were able to basically persist in place in some cases. These are not the only kinds of responses that these taxa exhibited. In some cases, taxa exhibited many different kinds of responses in different parts of their ranges or different habitats. But we do have examples of species that just stuck around. They didn't do anything, they didn't move while the environment changed around them. In some cases, we had examples of habitat shifts where small scale shifts to different slopes or aspects on the same mountain or different sort of elevations within a mountain range allowed species to persist mostly in place just by shifting the way that they use their habitat. We also see large-scale migrations of hundreds to thousands of kilometers, and then there are some examples of climate-driven extinctions. They're thought to be rare. I'll get back to that question. But these sort of responses, toleration and habitat shifts, those would kind of fall under that category of persistence. So we don't, you don't necessarily have to have a species moving really far. You'll notice that adaptation is missing largely from this. Adaptation could be a driver of how species are able to tolerate or their existing climate changes or shifting, sort of within local areas. It's really hard to look at adaptation in the fossil record, although people do that work, but I'm going to leave that one aside for today. So I'm going to share a few different examples from the literature of these kinds of responses. And the concept of climate refugia is really important when trying to understand how species are able to either, in some cases, tolerate climate change in place or make these small scale movements in, within their ranges. And these refuges are basically places where the climatic conditions are ameliorated in some way. So they're small pockets of favorable climates within a region of more adverse climates, adverse for that species, right? And the idea of a climatic refuge is that it's a place that species can expand from when environments become more suitable. So it's always it's thought of in this framework as a place where species can hang out, but the idea is that they will then someday in the future go back to a broader sort of range expansion. And so you could imagine in this case, so a warm interglacial, if you look here by low latitude to high latitude, this is just a one-dimensional representation of ranges. In this case, we have, ice sheets and the sort of deserts and tundra that are just south of those ice sheets. And you can imagine, these are unfavorable climates. And so species are hanging out in some sort of mid-latitude. And then with the glacial expansion of those glaciers and those cold and dry climates, those species have to sort of shift away, or more equatorward, away from those unfavorable climates. But you might have small local places, maybe certain valleys or or river bottoms or something, where you have climates that are favorable for that species to persist, even though the vast majority of its distribution is far away from that location. And then the idea is that during an interglacial, again, as the climate's warm, those species shifts its range back sort of towards its previous distribution, but there might be contributors from, sort of the like leading edge of its range, its more southern range, or it might be repopulating from that climatic refuge. We actually don't know very much. We need a lot more genetic work to understand the relative role of these refugia, but they do allow species to persist in place. We know that from the past, and that's probably going to be important going forward into the future. And there are places where we just don't see a lot of change happening in the fossil record. Those periods of stasis are really interesting to me. I think, they could be indicative of these kinds of refugia, of sort of resilience responses. We tend not to pay a lot of attention to them because they're kind of boring. If you look at a graph like this is 15,000 years, some of Andrea Brunel's work. And if you look at this, it's like, wow, if you were a grad student, you might find this to be a really disappointing pollen diagram, because it's like, okay, we have pine pollen in the record pretty much from 14,000 years ago all the way to the present. Maybe there's this exciting little dip here 8,000 years ago, but for the most part, there's not a lot of dramatic change here. I think that's been, kind of a failure of imagination on our part. In this paper, Andrea makes the point that, that the topography in this area is basically buffering the effects of the regional climate changes that are going on around the site. There's a lot happening here climatically during these 15,000 years, from warming and cooling events to big scale changes in hydrology that would have driven changes in the regional plant communities. But because of these topographic conditions, there's sort of a buffer there. So this is kind of something of a refuge for these tree populations. And that might help explain why we do see times where there are just, persistence, where nothing really happens despite the sort of broader scale, large climatic shifts in the surrounding area. We also know that in these elevational gradients, these small scale shifts up and down slope can be super important for explaining the persistence of different plants. This is some work done by Steve Jackson and Ray Spear and others in the White Mountains, where now we're looking at time from left to right, 14,000 years ago to the present. And this is just the abundance of birch seeds, Betula lenta or lutea, at various ponds through time. So you can see that there's this upward shift in elevation as the climate warms going into, you see these elevational shifts as the climate warms and then cools from this period from 10,000 years ago to 2,000 years ago. So at first you see that it's basically these seeds are not present at lower elevations, but you do find them present at higher elevations, and then they're able to sort of expand downwards during this period of climatic cooling in the Northeast. And so, these small scale elevational shifts have been really important for the persistence of a lot of Arctic and alpine plants in the Northeast, whose nearest neighbors might be, far up in the Arctic. And they've just been kind of persisting in place, through thousands of years of climate change at relatively low elevation, right? These are not high mountains relative to, say, the Rockies or, the Alps. We do know that many species have had to move thousands of kilometers in order to track their climates. There are more up-to-date versions of this map, but I wanted to throw back to, since this is Minnesota, to Margaret Davis, who did a lot of the really foundational work here with these identifying these range shifts through time. So you can see these little postage stamps of the different time steps. In climate, we have spruce and then oak, looking at the shifts of these ranges through time of these different tree species as the glaciers are retreating and the climates are warming. And one thing you'll notice, I'll come back to this again and again, is that these species range shifts are very individualistic. They're not actually all following the same kinds of trackways and pathways. And at different times, these species may be more or less abundant in their communities as well. There's not every species, best time to be an ash tree was 13,000 years ago, not necessarily today. So we can expect to see not just shifts in ranges, but also shifts in abundances as well. And it's going to be highly individualistic. And, this isn't a new idea, but I think we forget, going back 100 years ago, Henry Chandler Cowell's, working on sort of these classic dune successional sequences, wrote that vegetation is a variable approaching a variable rather than a constant. And I think that's something that's really important to keep in mind, especially as we're thinking about restoration targets and, what our expectations are. Are those expectations reasonable even without climate change? And we certainly know that the climate is changing. So how much dynamism are we willing to accept in the places that we're responsible for as managers or as conservationists? And I would also say that, to get back at this idea of individualism, this is some work by Jack Williams, my graduate advisor, where he looked at how these the individualistic responses of these species to climate change results in combinations of plants that we don't necessarily see on the landscape today. And so this idea of a community, is really a temporary assemblage, just as much in time as it is across space. We've learned that from, decades of work by folks like, Whitaker and others who've looked at gradient analyses and looked at the spatial distribution of species. We know that communities aren't these coherent units in space, and that's true across time as well in many cases. So if you look at the mapped distribution of pollen and for spruce and ash today, the reason we're using pollen is so we can compare it to the past. You would say that spruce and ash aren't really found together. There seems to be this sort of almost suture zone where they kind of fit together, their ranges fit together like puzzle pieces. But if you were to go back 13,000 years ago, not only is there an ice sheet covering up a large portion of their potential ranges, but they also coexist south of that ice margin. And in fact, you might also have noticed that we get these larger concentrations, higher abundance, these dark blobs indicate higher abundances of those taxa than you would find anywhere today. So that's what I meant when I said, today is not a really great time to be an ash tree, but 13,000 years ago was where it's at, from ash's perspective. And so we know that these individualistic range shifts drove the formation of novel plant associations or no analog communities or novel ecosystems. These terms are used somewhat interchangeably at times. They were widely distributed south of the ice sheets, and both because of these changes in the co-occurrence of species and because of the unusual abundance of species relative to today. So these are the same, components of the ecosystem we have now. They just weren't found. They're not found growing together today for the most part. And we know this thanks to, a huge network of both fossil and modern pollen samples. And, this is all predicted by niche theory. You actually don't have to change anything about species in order to drive these novel associations, because we know that the realized environment is changing through time. This is adapted from one of my favorite papers. If you're interested in these ideas, especially related to plants, check out Jackson and Overpeck 2000. It was in a paleo journal, so I don't think it ever really got as much attention as I think it should have. But if you imagine your, whatever favorite environmental variables you have, and you have these two species here, a green species and an orange species, they have some set of environmental tolerances, but they're constrained by what the realized environmental space. So the actual combinations of temperature and precipitation that are available on the planet now. And those combinations change through time. They've changed in the past, and they will change going into the future. And so you can see that all you have to do is change the available climate space, and suddenly there are climate spaces where two taxa can coexist, where they previously weren't able to. And that could be true, kind of hindcasting into the past or looking into the future. So we should be expecting these kinds of interactions to happen again, just as they've happened in the past. And, one of the outcomes of this is just, I really hate this map because it's just, trees don't care about geopolitical boundaries. But this is a map of tree endemics. And you'll see that, this, as I'll show also later, there's a high degree of tree endemism in the Southeast, partly because of the relative climatic stability that's existed there, but also because, the Southeast has been a climatic refuge for a lot of the more northern species of trees that have kind of come down from the north as the glaciers have advanced. And so what's really interesting is that there are some hard southern boundaries that those trees could not get across, right? They couldn't get over that, Gulf of Mexico boundary. And yet, from what we understand, there have been very few tree extinctions. And so these tree communities were very accommodating to these northern migrants. And so similarly, we can expect that as climates warm and a lot of these species have to track their environments north, a lot of these species will co-occur again in the future, just as they did when this was the glacial refuge. So not only did these southern species persist in place, but they also accepted the incoming northern migrants. And so we're gonna have to flip that on its head. And so those of us who live in more northern environments are gonna start to see these climatic migrants coming into our communities. We're already starting to see that now. And this isn't just true for plants. This is a very plant heavy talk, but for all the animal folks out there, we've also seen this in the fossil record when it comes to mammals. So this is a site, right here in the center. There's a cave in Iowa where these three species of small mammal coexisted for thousands of years: northern bog lemming, prairie dog, and eastern chipmunk. Following deglaciation, each one of these species sorted itself into highly segregated ranges today. And so if you look, this little patch here, that's the prairie dog range. The northern, so prairie dog actually went west, northern bog lemming went north, eastern chipmunk went east, and you can see there's almost no overlap for any of these species ranges now, but they co-occurred in the center of what is now the US for thousands of years during full glacial conditions. So we see these same kinds of dynamics playing out between small mammals. And you would think that there's got to be some process that's segregating these ranges now, but they actually did coexist for a really long time. And these past climate changes have really strong fingerprints on our contemporary biodiversity. This little black line here represents the ice sheets. This is a map on top of the past climate velocities. So these are the rates at which these species would have had to have achieved in order to match their climates as those climates warmed and they had to move across landscapes. And you can see that there are very low levels of endemism in the places that have experienced the highest climate velocities. And then if you look at places where we expect future high climate velocities, those are actually in some of the places that have experienced low climate velocities in the past and have high degrees of endemism now. And so, that suggests that we might need to be a little bit more proactive in terms of our conservation strategies and making sure that those species are able to get to the places that they need to go, because a lot of our northern species, even though we're experiencing accelerated rates of climate change, a lot of these species are well adapted to shifting their ranges. They've experienced high velocities of climate change in the past, so in their recent evolutionary history. So this isn't something new for them, versus these more tropical species or endemics in these montane regions where they haven't experienced a lot of the same climate changes in the past, but are expected to in the future. So they might not be able to accommodate those climate changes without help. Interestingly, this is another set of examples looking at plant traits. If you look at functional richness, you can also see this fingerprint of past climatic changes. And if you're trying to figure out what's most important in driving the community assembly or the distributions or the richness of the species that you're interested in, this is true for plants. We need to do this for other kinds of species too. But it turns out that past climate change is just as important or more important in explaining present day functional richness as some of these other kinds of things that we tend to measure and think are more important. So this accessibility, this is basically how accessible were these habitats as the ice sheets melted. So post-glacial climate change and habitat accessibility, in many cases, is more important at explaining modern patterns of functional richness than things like modern day precipitation or NDVI or topographic variability. So we need to be keeping in mind the prehistoric experiences that these species have gone through, because that's still shaping our contemporary biodiversity patterns today. All right. In response to these changes, we actually haven't the conventional wisdom is that we haven't seen a lot of climate-driven extinctions in the last, at least 21,000 years, which some like Daniel Botkin and others have called a quaternary conundrum, right? That climate change is predicted to drive species extinctions into the future. And so we would expect to see lots of climate-driven extinctions in response to all this glacial climate change. But we haven't seen a whole lot of that. There's only one known example of a presumably climate-driven plant extinction in North America, and that's this example, Picea critchfieldii, which was this southern pine species, or excuse me, spruce species. It's different, it's been identified to be different both in terms of its needle and its pollen morphology from all the other species of Picea. And so, we know that this was around from a few sites in the Southeast, and then it just disappears. And, people have looked for it. It's not present today. We don't know why it went extinct. But it's kind of it's an interesting Rorschach test, because, some people might look at this and see this as sort of a poster child of the possibilities for things like Torreya taxifolia, right, where we might need to intervene actively in order to prevent, further extinction of these rare conifers in the Southeast. So where we have lots of endemism, you often also have lots of rarity. And so, there's lots of reasons why things might be rare, but understanding, whether that's a response to previous climatic changes or some other process, that's going to be really important going forward. All right. In Europe, in contrast, there actually have been quite a lot of climate-driven tree extinctions, mostly because of barriers to dispersal. So these trees would basically run up against the Mediterranean climate. So that climate was more of a barrier than the physical barrier of the east-west mountain ranges. So they would run up against this, winter wet, summer dry climate. And what's interesting is if you look at the extinct species, and you'll recognize a lot of the same genera that we have in Eastern North America, a lot of these extinct species tend to be more of the warm loving taxa, sort of warm, and there's a spread here in terms of precipitation affinities. So the irony of the last 2.5 million years in Europe is that they've lost all the trees that would do really well in the climate that we're heading towards in the future, right? And so this dispersal barrier has actually been, played a really big role. It's very rarely climate change per se that, absolute warming that causes these extinctions, as I'll get into. It's the presence of these dispersal barriers. All right, so I'm going to show you a couple of examples of some research that we've done in the lab. The first is going to focus on the move part of move, adapt, or die. The second is going to focus on the die part. Like I said, I'm not going to touch adapt, and we do have some work going on in the lab on persistence, so the persistent place. We're working on New England alpine plant refugia. So that's a project that we're just starting to spin up now. But for right now, I'm just going to focus on moving and death. It is a fossil talk, so there's going to be some death. All right, and most of the work I'm going to show you right now was done by my former PhD student, Ben Seliger. He's now a postdoc at NCSU. All right, so there's a persistent question. There's a growing interest in climatic disequilibrium, and folks are really interested in whether or not trees are in equilibrium with climate. So we decided to tackle this from a couple of different angles. And for the first, we wanted to basically look at whether trees are in equilibrium with climate right now. I should say this is no longer in revision. This is out in Journal of Biogeography. Officially came out in 2021. So we looked at 447 species of trees using the EL Little USGS ranges and we modeled those ranges with 4 variables: GDD, minimum temperature, water. We looked at water balance because that's really important in distinguishing eastern versus western trees, and also the timing of precipitation for the same reason. So we basically mapped their existing ranges and then looked at these climatic variables, and then used a series of species distribution models to model their potential climatic ranges. We did this at a series of different scales, and I should say we also tried this with the FIA data. There's reasons we decided to use Little instead of FIA, including the fact that FIA includes a lot of anthropogenic locations, so park trees and city trees, and also does not extend into Canada, which is kind of a problem. I'm going to show you what we found. I should say, here's how we did it. So what we did is we took that, the realized range, so that's the hash marks here. So this is one example. This is an approach from Svenning and Skov from a paper in 2003 where they did this in Europe. And so then we modeled the potential range of that tree. So this is one example from one species. And then we just looked at the proportion of the potential range that the species actually fills. So this is a technique called range filling. So high range filling would be, you basically are growing everywhere that you could grow climatically. And this is just climate. So it doesn't account for things like soils. We have a new high resolution soil map. So, somebody should definitely do that at some point. But one thing that's nice is that this approach can also allow you to ask some questions about what proportion of a tree species range is controlled by things that aren't climate, right? There's some cool work by Mark Velland and others that are suggesting that even at these continental scales, climate's not the full story. There are biotic interactions that could also be limiting where species can grow, even though they, are actually growing, even though they can grow there climatically. All right, so here's what we found. We did this for 447 trees. So the first thing we found that was really surprising was that the biggest predictor of range filling was range size. So we found this interesting relationship where if you are a large range species, you tend to be filling up more of your potential range than if you're a small range species. And we think that this is ecological. We don't think this is an artifact of geometry. It makes sense that if you are something like white spruce and you're widely distributed, you just have more continental area to fill up. You're probably going to be able to get to most of those places in the first, for the same reasons that make you successful and large ranged to begin with. But we didn't want this relationship to be influencing our results. And so what we did is for the future graphs, we're going to talk about the residuals, right? So we're going to account for that range size, range filling relationship and just look at the residuals. All right, so the next thing that we did is we wanted to know whether trees had better or worse range filling than a null model. And so Ben actually created a bunch of simulated ranges using a spreading die algorithm that were all the same set of sizes as the actual ranges, but were randomized in their position across North America. And what's really interesting, so the open gray circles are the simulated ranges and the closed green dots, those are the real data. And so what's really interesting here is that if you look, these are the two trend lines. Large range species are doing better than random, but small range species are doing worse than random at filling their available climatic niches. So there's there's a scaling relationship here. This is very, again, sort of scale dependent, where there's a different set of rules for small ranged trees than for large ranged trees. And so that could relate to the fact that there are different reasons why things might be rare. Maybe they're a soil endemic, maybe there's some environmental history at play. Maybe they're just on the tail end of their available climates because they're just a tree that was better suited to conditions 20 million years ago than today. We don't really know, but it suggests that these small range species might need extra help as we move into a warming world in tracking their available climates. All right. Oh, and I just here's where I spell that out. So we're going to look at the residuals. So positive residuals have a high range filling for its given range size. So that, again, by looking at residuals, we kind of eliminate the influence of the range size, range filling relationship. So if you have a positive residual, you have a high range filling given your range size. And if it's a negative residual, you have a low range filling for a given range size. So now I'm going to show you these data in a slightly different way. So going forward into the next study. And so one thing I should say though, I didn't mention this. One thing we found from these results is that on average, trees were basically filling about just under 50% of their potential climatic ranges across the board. And obviously there's a huge spread where large range species tend to be filling closer to 100% and smaller range species are underfilling their ranges. But on average, trees are, of the 447 species of trees we looked at in North America, trees are only filling up about half of their potential climatic ranges on average. And, we'll get back to why that might be in a moment. All right, so then we wanted to take this and use the fossil record to see if these relationships were set up a long time ago. Are we seeing the impacts of post-glacial dispersal lags, or is there something that's happening, that's more recent? And so once you look at range filling through time, that allows you to look at the responses of these trees to the known climate changes that we've already experienced. So if you imagine in this little cartoon, you could have range filling values that drop, and then you might have some recovery, right? So here's some abrupt climate change. Maybe there's a lag in terms of when that species responds. So that would be a disequilibrium response. But if we don't see a drop in range filling in response to a climate change, that means that species is able to track its climate change no matter how rapid it is, right? So it's within equilibrium. And so, we can basically pick up these dynamics through time. All right. You could also imagine that for some species, there's no recovery, right? So if range filling declines following multiple climate changes, then you have this accumulation of lags that are a response to something that happened a long time ago. So basically, trees fell behind and just never caught up. And what you see now is really a response to something that happened in the past, but doesn't actually reflect the current climatic conditions. All right, so to do this, we turned to the pollen record. We looked at 21,000 years of pollen data at 1,000 year time steps, using, I think, about 15 different pollen taxa. And so we just did the same approach. Obviously, it's a much smaller number and the taxonomic resolution is different. So we're mostly at the genus level here for pollen. And we had to limit this to Eastern North America because that's just where the data are available. But otherwise, we did the same thing. We created our own ranges through interpolation from pollen records, built the realized ranges, and then modeled the potential climatic ranges and looked at range and then calculated range filling through time at these 1,000 year time steps. So what we found is, unsurprisingly, a high degree of individualism. So here are all the taxa that we analyzed. If you want to kind of squint and look at this spaghetti, you can track your favorite tree taxon through time. And again, so this is the residuals, right? So if it's above this line, it's doing well for its given range size. If it's, so it has high range filling for its range size. If it's below the line, it has low range filling, factoring for its given range size. This isn't a really informative way to look at the data though. So we're gonna kind of zoom out a little bit. If you just look at the mean range filling over time, we do pick up some really interesting trends. This dashed line is the range separation. So that's how far the centroid of your actual range is from the centroid of where it could be, right? So not only how far how much are you falling behind tracking your climate, how physically far are you away from it? And so what we see, the light gray is when, we're in the positive. So, we're doing well at tracking our climates, and then the low range filling is the sort of dark gray here. What's really interesting is we have these periods of abrupt climate change here where we do see declines in range filling, but we see recovery. And in some cases, species are actually doing really well at tracking their climates, even in periods of high or rapid climatic change. And what's really weird and was surprising to us is that this decline in range filling started accumulating only in the last sort of 3,000 to 5,000 years during a period of relative climate stability. This is not what we expected. And so what this suggests is that the current climate disequilibrium that we observe today, that 50% range filling that we observed for all tree species, that's a more recent phenomenon. That's not something that's this accumulation of climate change lags through time. There's something else going on there. And there's a couple of different potential hypotheses. So it doesn't, we mapped this out against climate velocities. And you can see that, there are changes in climatic velocity through time, but this decline in range filling happens in a period of relatively low climate velocity. So it's not that climate change has been happening faster. So we can kind of eliminate that as a potential driver. And then we decided to try to decompose climate change, it's not just warming, maybe it's precipitation, maybe it's minimum temperature, maybe it's growing degree days. So we modeled all of these for the last 21,000 years. And again, none of these line up with the timing of these declines. Maybe GDD, but there doesn't really seem to be a very strong, indicator of, one of these climatic drivers. So we don't think that this is what's driving this pattern. We have some other ideas. We're not really sure, but one possibility could be, human land use. So this is an estimate of human populations that from previous work that's been done by others, and so we do see this decline in range filling happening around the time of the intensification of land use and the development of agriculture for a lot of Eastern indigenous societies. So perhaps what we're seeing is just the fingerprint of human land use. And so that's one possibility. Another possibility is that during this period of relative climatic stability, we have a metric here of competition that is based on some work that Jessica Blois did, looking at whether species tend to be found together or apart in the pollen record, so aggregated or segregated pairs of taxa. If you're interested in that approach, I can send you a paper. But we also see this increase, sort of fingerprint of competition that seems to happen around the same time. So another possibility here is that as climates are stable, maybe there's just more time for these sort of eco-evolutionary relationships to play out, and competition among taxa kind of intensifies. All right, so some take-home messages from this work. First, the recent fossil record shows evidence of recovery following abrupt change. So plants are able to track some climate change. They're able to accommodate a certain amount. And these range filling declines are only accumulating in the last few thousand years. So something else is going on. So these post-glacial dispersal lags don't seem to have driven the modern observed climatic disequilibrium that we see in North America. And the current underfilled ranges may reflect competition, human impacts, some other ecological process, but they don't seem to be an artifact of dispersal lag. So it's not that trees just can't keep up with climate change. There could be something else going on. Importantly, though, regardless of the reason, many North American trees are already in disequilibrium with climate. And so smaller range trees in particular, they might need our active intervention to help track their climates through things like managed relocation. All right, so I want to shift gears here. I know I'm running out of time, so I'm going to go a little bit quickly and share some work on the prehistoric record of climate-driven extinctions, because this idea that I've circled back to a few times of, despite the widespread climate change that has been observed in the past, we haven't seen very many climate-driven extinctions in the last 2.5 million years of glacial cycles. I want to revisit that because it potentially, it's important to resolve this quaternary conundrum, right? We need to know whether or not our predictions of future extinction risk might be overblown, right? Are we looking at something like 2.8 to 16% of species being committed to extinction? What does the Ice Age record of climate change have to offer this question? And it turns out it's a lot. This is our current interglacial. This is the last 2.8 million years. You can see we've had these, this general cooling, these regular swings of climate change from cold to warm that have intensified over time. So by about 750,000 years ago, we start to see really high amplitude swings between, cold interglacial, cold glacials, warm interglacials, cold glacials, warm interglacials. And some of the, these recent interglacials might have been as warm or warmer than our current one. And so these are good analogs for the kinds of climatic stressors that species would have gone through. In response to this, some people have looked at the fossil record and said, this calls into question whether high estimates of extinction risk due to current and future climate change are inflated, right? Well, that's something we need to resolve. And so the goal here is to kind of synthesize the fossil record of extinction. And just so you don't have to remember the full chronology of paleoclimate changes over 2.8 million years, I just simplified it with a color bar. So we have warm, cool, transition, colder, and then our current warm period here. So I synthesized the literature on climatic-driven extinctions. You can see here that there's a whole lot going on in this diagram, but the little cartoons tell you what kinds of things are going extinct. The letter codes tell you where these extinction records are from. The dots and dashed lines really represent our temporal uncertainty, like how sure are we that things are happening in the fossil record within this window. And then the colors of those lines represent the intensity. So we have in some cases more than 21 taxa. The blue is 6 to 20, the gray is less than 6. And these sets up here with a dot dash dot, those are a special case I'll get into in a second. But the important thing here is that there are extinctions that happen throughout the last 2.8 million years that have been attributed to climate change. They're global. They're for every taxonomic group that we have a fossil record for. I left out the marine record, so this is just focusing on the terrestrial record. And so, when we look at this record, we can actually start to pull some patterns out. There's one pattern that's really important here, is that there are certain regions that have experienced extinctions that are associated with glacials and interglacials, right? And so the periods of transition are really important. And so, one of these we're calling sort of filter extinctions, where, to harken back to that example of the European trees, if they run into some kind of dispersal barrier, every time that there's an ice age, the trees kind of pack down south, and then they kind of run up against this barrier, they can't get over, and a few species get lost. Climate warms, they move back. Climate cools, they go down. A few more are lost. So there's sort of a few losses every time due to these dispersal barriers. So there's this long-term decline in tree diversity that happens in Europe over time. There's another sort of process that I'm tentatively calling like a seesaw, where we have these habitats that flicker on and off. They're only associated with glacial or interglacial climate changes. So during glacial periods that are cold, all the water is locked up in the ice sheet, and the sea level drops by a couple hundred meters. So, in this case, the Florida basically doubles in size, and you get this massive expansion of coastal habitats and a big diversification of coastal birds. And so there's a wonderful fossil record in Florida that shows that during each of these glacial periods, you get speciation of these birds. And then during interglacials, when this habitat gets flooded because the sea level rises, those birds don't move elsewhere, they just go extinct. And this process just happens over and over and over again. And there are a couple other places where this is going on. One good example where we think this might happen too would be someplace like Death Valley, right? So during glacial conditions, because of changes in the position of the jet stream, Death Valley, all of these little banded layers you see here, those are actually lake bed sediments. So Death Valley would have been a cool, moist environment that was heavily vegetated. So during glacial conditions, it looks something like this. During interglacials, it looks like that, right? And we have a decent fossil record of Death Valley that shows that when it fills in and becomes a lake, there's a speciation event for a lot of freshwater fishes. And those fish have nowhere to go when the jet stream migrates back north again and the lake dries up. So they just go extinct. So we get this process of speciation, extinction happening over and over again. Similarly, in Jellyfish Lake in Palau, there's a whole lot of species that have evolved just since sea level rose, and seawater sort of permeates this limestone island complex, and you get this little marine lake that is separate from the ocean, but fills up with marine invertebrates. So there's a huge speciation event that happens within a lake like this. And then if you imagine in a glacial condition, that lake drains, those species have nowhere to go, and they go extinct. So these processes are probably happening continuously. Now, the point of this is not to make you, and there's various other places where this might happen, like Lake Victoria, some of the island mammal endemics in Mexico. The point here is not to get you to be upset about all these cryptic extinctions from the fossil record that we can probably never know about, but rather that these are probably places where we should be keeping an eye out for future extinction risk going forward. So if you look at the places where we see extinction happening in the fossil record, all those examples, both the theoretical ones and then the actual ones where we do have a record of fossils, there's a few different processes that really rise to the top and seem to drive extinction the most. One big one is aridification, these large scale changes in the position of the jet stream or the intertropical convergence zone, or these other processes, the monsoons, these processes that have huge impacts on how wet or dry a place is. Especially when wet places become dry, we seem to see a lot of extinction. Habitat loss, so places like that example in Florida, right, where we just completely lose the habitat, or Jellyfish Lake, or especially these discrete habitats that aren't well connected to other places. So there's just nowhere, so it's like there's a habitat loss and a dispersal barrier, kind of double whammy. Dispersal barriers are a big one as well. So species can track their climates usually, but if there's something in the way, they can't do that. And then of course, sea level rise being a big one as well, which, all of these interact, these aren't necessarily unique, isolated drivers, but looking at the places where this is going to happen in the future could, having a more mechanistic approach to identifying risk and exposure for species could be a way to go. And I would love to talk to somebody who would like to, maybe do a postdoc to do some of this modeling to try to identify heat maps of risk on the ground where these kinds of processes are going to play out. So rather than just looking at this straight temperature relationship with species, we should be thinking a little bit more about mechanisms that drive extinction. And then we can look at the places where those mechanisms are going to play out and see what kinds of interventions might be needed. All right, so some take-home messages, and hopefully we have time for questions. There's a lot of work that's being done in the field of conservation paleobiology, but almost no examples where that work is directly applied in conservation management and practice. So we're still very siloed as a discipline, and we need to figure out how to make better partnerships so that the prehistoric record is actually available and useful to the people who are making decisions on the ground. So we need to do that better. Secondly, we need to start really thinking about the ways in which our conservation strategies are not robust to climate change. The Endangered Species Act is not robust to climate change, right? Protecting a place where a species is found now, but not protecting where it's going to go, sets up a lot of species for failure. So we have to start thinking outside the box, maybe things like managed relocation, rewilding, and this idea of conserving nature's stage. So using geophysical surrogates for biodiversity. So places that are geodiverse tend to be very biodiverse over long timescales. So we need to be more open-minded in those approaches. Thirdly, we spend a lot of time worrying about vulnerability, but we should also be focusing on resilience. So thinking about, why is it that the musk ox made it through the last deglaciation when the mammoth went extinct, right? What is it about being a muskox? Is it something unique to its biology? Is there something else going on? So those cases where we don't see these big dramatic shakeups, that's actually really interesting. And those are the species and communities and ecosystems that might give us a roadmap into the future. And of course, like I said, with all this emphasis on change and loss and risk, let's also remember that, everything that we've seen outside, in the environment in our lifetimes, for the most part, is an ice age survivor, right? It's dealt with many of these changes in the past. And, there's something really interesting and empowering, I think, about, looking to those examples for how we can kind of help other species usher through this era of global change. And with that, I'd like to thank my lab, our funding sources, and also the Neotoma database, which is this wonderful paleobiology database that's supported a lot of our work. So hopefully we have some time for questions. Thanks.
Thanks, Dr. Gill. That was a really fascinating talk. I don't see anything in the chat right now, but I'd encourage anyone, if you have a question, please unmute, feel free to ask, or drop it in the chat.
I'll go ahead and ask a question. So I really enjoyed your talk. My background is in a lot of what I do is study movement ecology of invertebrates. And so I really enjoyed how you talked about accessibility. And I think that's plays an important role. And I wondered if you thought at all about incorporating that in your species distribution models.
I would love to do that, especially now. I mean, I think these analogs only go so far. Even though I've worked a lot on post-glacial migration of trees, you know, to get a lot of effort's been put into looking at those rates to think about, okay, well, how fast can species move in the future? Those rates are only so informative because the landscape just is not, it's much more fragmented now, right? And so we have to be aware of that. And so I think one thing that would be really interesting would be, David Ackerley's done some of this, some other folks are starting to do this, where, you know, if you look at the pathways these species had or have for migration, that's going to be really informative too. And one of the reasons I'm interested in working in these New England alpine communities is they're kind of an archipelago, right? And that's probably going to be a better analog for species because they're so disjunct, they're disjointed. So you have sort of some islands that are closer together and the green mountains and the white, and then you have Katahdin that's kind of out all by itself. It's super isolated. So how much connectivity is there among those populations? What are the mechanisms for species to get around, or is there any gene flow? Are we just losing species slowly through time? Why, which ones? So those kinds of questions I think are important for, you know, figuring out why some things are persisting in place, and then how much movement there is through time, and what the actual physical pathways of that movement might be. I think that's really mission critical. Thanks. And I've done that more with plants. People, you know, do try to do that with vertebrates in the fossil record too. It's a little bit harder, but you can kind of get there.
Yeah, I was just thinking in the sorts of work that I tend to do with modeling movement, we think of like a dispersal kernel, multiplied by some habitat suitability kernel. And I think plants are really similar, it's just a different time scale. You know, their ability to disperse may be intergenerational versus an animal that's moving over the landscape. But I think there's probably a lot of overlap that could, you know, you could probably borrow some of the same sorts of ideas from how we model, say, movement of terrestrial mammals in a terrestrial environment. So.
Yeah, and I didn't talk about it, but there's this thing called Reed's paradox, where our dispersal kernels that we have for plants predict much slower rates of movement than we actually see in the paleo record. And so the question has been, are our dispersal kernels bad because they don't account for things like long distance dispersal events enough, or is there some other reason? You know, we're not getting those rare seed dispersal events or something. Or did we have species growing in refugia that are cryptic, sort of undiscoverable in the pollen record, closer to the ice sheets? So the distance they had to travel is smaller. There's some mixed results from some genetic data that kind of speaks to that, but it's still something of an outstanding question. Probably both is the answer, but yeah.
It looks like we do have one more question in the chat from Sam.
Yeah.
So he asks, what do you think are some of the most promising avenues for building those connections to conservation practice you mentioned?
Yeah, I think you have to get people in the room together, and start, you know, local, you know, reach out. We've been doing this a lot with Acadia National Park just because they're very interested. Compared to most of the Park Service, they're less conservative in terms of, you know, just being open to change. They're actively managing the park for climate change, which is not true for a lot of other parks. And so, yeah, so getting people on the ground, building partnerships, not just with conservation agencies, but also with Indigenous communities, you know, putting in the work of the sort of long-term trust and kind of relationship building, because, you know, something like 80% of biodiversity is managed on Indigenous lands today. And, you know, we need to be recognizing the power of their stewardship and, you know, building those partnerships too. So I think it means like just creating tables and inviting all the relevant stakeholders to those tables. I was part of a managed relocation working group back in like 2008, and it was just really eye-opening to have, you know, you had ethicists and you had geneticists and biologists and paleoecologists and other folks who were basically saying like, oh gosh, we have to be really careful. We can't just move species around, you know, it could just disrupt everything. And then the Forest Service guys were like, we've been doing this for like decades. What's the matter? What are you talking about? Like, why are you freaking out? And everyone else at the table was like, and it was just like the cultural differences were wild. And you just don't overcome those. You can't expect people to get at stuff from the literature that you're publishing in if they're not reading that literature. Get out of your comfort zone with papers and start writing white papers, start tweeting, start, getting your results out to where your audience is. But also just, brokering those conversations, like knock on doors and talk to people and get diverse perspectives at the table. And so, yeah, we haven't done that very well yet. It's hard sometimes to even convince, I had a grant rejected once that went to the Northeast Forest Cooperative. And the only feedback I got was paleoecology is not a priority, but it was about the hemlock decline. It's like, we can tell you why hemlock tree, like we could tell you useful information about hemlock death. It's happened before. But it was just like this idea that no, paleo is that's like this novel deep time thing that's not relevant. And so we have challenges to overcome, but it's easier to do that when you're at the table. Elliot, looks like you have your hand up.
I do, yeah. I thought maybe that'd be a useful way to get a question and given the number of people here. Well, that was a really, really great talk. I showed up a little bit late, but it was really wonderful to hear about. I think I just kind of have maybe two parts to two slightly separate questions. One of them I think pertains to building off of Sam's question in the chat there. I've worked a lot with the Park Service as a Park Service employee. Now I'm studying paleoecology, and I think there's this intersection here that really interests me. So I think my first question, building off of that last one, is do you think that it seems that the academic environment kind of holds most of the paleoecological knowledge in the wealth of research that has come from academia? So one of my questions is, do you think it would be, if we want to see, say, the Park Service prioritize the information that we've collected at academia, do you think it's on academics to approach the Park Service with ideas for how to do that? And then as a sort of separate question, I was curious about the sort of human activity element that you mentioned as a potential driver of species range shifts. And I was thinking about, that got me thinking, because the range of time of human activity was somewhere around 5,000 for the past 5,000 years or so. And so it got me thinking, well, what kinds of human activity are we talking about here?
Yeah.
And so just thought I'd see if I could get you to elaborate on one or both of those.
Yeah, those are both great questions. The first one I think is, in my experience, when I've reached out to, my experience is mostly with Acadia, and they've been really open. They host a lot of research in the park. And there are different potential partnerships, and oftentimes there's knowledge exchange where park employees go off to get higher education and then come back into the park. And so I do think that there are sometimes their hands are tied, and it depends. There's a lot of politics involved, and it's going to be unique to the place that you're at. So being aware of that is important. I'm, like I said, I'm really fortunate to be at a very climate savvy park. Like, they're very much on top of it, and they're not managing the park to try to be, it's also a very cultural park too. Like, it's not a wilderness park like some other places. And so I think they're actively managing it dynamically. And also being a coastal park too, we're just sort of seeing a lot of the impacts of climate change really quickly. So I think, finding the place that's open to it is important. But I think increasingly that's the case. I think you just can't get around it at a certain point. But in my experience, they've been really open to, they often have like colloquia, so you can give a talk. Like Acadia has a brown bag for their interpreters. I've also been part of a program called ISWOOP, which stands for Interpreters and Scientists Working on Our Parks. And Acadia was sort of a pilot program for that. And so I've worked a lot with park interpreters who were super, who are often just summer temporary employees, and helped them to bring paleo programming in, too many P's, paleo park programming. And so sometimes that involves, me providing resources like 3D model printed pollen grains and little, easily accessible charts that they can use and bring out into their interpretation. And so they've also often been super keen to come into the field. So when we've gone and cored lakes in the park, we'll let the park staff know, and then the interpreters or the rangers come out. And so there's a lot of capacity building that happens through the interpreters, and they love to tell stories of active science happening in the parks. And so I think that that can be a way to get your foot in the door and start building the relationships. Then your second question was about what kinds of human activities. That's a really good question. I think it's going to vary a lot. There are a lot of cultural differences that got lumped into that histogram of human population. And it was really just sort of it correlates in many cases with the adoption of agriculture, but not in all cases. And so I think, agricultural intensification could be one mechanism. There are a lot of other cultural changes that are happening in that sort of 5,000 to 3,000 year window across the many, many diverse Native cultures represented within the study region. And so I think, this is one of those cases where local scale study is going to be really important. And oral knowledge and talking to the people who live in those places or whose ancestors, were in those places is going to be important. Yeah, it's kind of an interesting question. And it's funny too, though, because it's not just in North America. There's been a whole bunch of studies that are starting to come out. Kate Lyons had a paper using that pairs approach where they noticed an increase in, I think it's an increase in segregated pairs. So some big ecological changes have started happening at the global scale around 3,000 to 5,000 years ago. And so something is going on globally. So even at that scale, even with that diversity of regions, ecosystems, species, and cultures, something changed in potentially maybe maybe it's environmental, maybe it's in that human environment relationship or those relationships. We just don't know. But I think what it does is you identify the pattern that allows you to ask the questions, and then you figure out, okay, well, what do we do on the ground? So that's, the strength of macroecology is like when you pick up these macro level patterns, something's happening. And so then the question is, okay, how do you drill down at these smaller scales and get a mechanism? So it's a really good question.
Thanks a lot for that. It was really thoughtful. Appreciate it.
Well, it looks like we're about 8 minutes over. So thanks again, Jacqueline, for coming. It was a great talk, and thanks everyone for attending.
Thanks. Sorry I went a little bit over, and if you have questions that you didn't get to ask, please reach out via email or Twitter or something. I'm happy to chat more. So thanks all. Take care.